A 4-year-old girl was locked in a rusty cage in a silent town for months. No one asked. No one said anything. Until a billionaire stopped at a gas station, heard a whisper, and turned around. Henry Shaw, 55, billionaire, founder of the Lightwell Foundation. He came to Burnsville to scout land for a treatment center. But life didn't bring him there to see the land. It brought him to sit next to a cage that the entire town had chosen to turn its back on. Inside that cage was Elin, 4 years old. Skinny and sitting there, silent as a forgotten object. He took off his coat, placed it on the bars, the anger radiating from his eyes, and then uttered one sentence. "She's not a wild animal. She's a child." Listen to the story to see the billionaire's wonderful and warm-hearted journey with the unfortunate child. The sky was the color of ash as the black Bentley rolled slowly into Burnsville, a small town, quiet, as if every sound needed permission to be heard. Winter here brought no snow, only a biting wind and a chill that crept into the soul. The scenery lining the streets consisted of permanently closed shops, leaning signs, and houses with rusted tin roofs that seemed accustomed to being forgotten. Inside the car, Henry Shaw sat upright in the back seat, his gaze fixed on the scene outside the window. He wore a dark charcoal wool coat, the cuff revealing an exquisitely crafted Swiss watch. Everything about him was meticulous, from the slight nod when he heard his assistant speak, to the way he carefully folded a document after reading it. Henry was 55, with silver threading through the hair at his temples. He wasn't a man of many words. As the founder of the Lightwell Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to building recovery centers for children with psychological trauma, he had come to Burnsville to survey a plot of land proposed for the next center. The car stopped at a small gas station. There was no sign, just a weathered grey wooden building, a rickety pump, and a man wiping his hands with a greasy rag. Henry stepped out of the car, nodded slightly to the driver, and went inside. No one greeted him. The clerk behind the counter simply glanced up and then looked down again. Henry didn't need to buy anything. He just wanted directions to the land south of town. "You're looking for land to build a center?" the clerk asked, his voice raspy from cigarette smoke. "That spot's all right, but—" Henry raised his eyes. His look wasn't forceful, but it was enough to prompt the man to continue. "There's talk, just rumors mostly. At the end of Maple Street behind the grey trailer, there's a little girl locked in a cage in the backyard. Been going on for years. Everyone knows, but nobody dares to get involved. Her family is complicated." Henry didn't ask any further questions. He just nodded slightly. His eyes didn't change expression, as if the information was simply another detail being added to the mental map he was drawing. He walked back to the car, closed the door quietly, and turned to his driver. "Take me to Maple Street, but don't draw attention." The driver only glanced at him in the rearview mirror and nodded. The car made a U-turn, turning onto a small gravel road, leaving behind the gas station and the furtive glances through the windows. Henry didn't look at his phone, didn't take notes. He just watched the road, as if every detail was being recorded in his memory. Maple Street had no maple trees, just the name left over from a time when the town was lush and green. The houses here were even more sparse and dilapidated than in the town center. Windows were boarded up with plywood. Children didn't play outside. Dogs didn't bark. The air here felt thick with something that had died long ago and never been buried. The grey trailer appeared after a bend in the road. No house number, no mailbox. Behind it was a patch of overgrown, weed-choked yard, and in the middle of that space, something that resembled a cage. Henry signaled for the driver to stop the car a distance away. He got out, adjusted his collar, and walked toward the house. He wasn't hurried, wasn't cautious, but every step had a clear purpose. As he got closer, he saw it clearly. a cage made of wire mesh and wooden pallets, makeshift, crooked, but still a cage, and inside, a child. She wasn't crying, not calling out, not looking at anyone, just sitting still, knees drawn to her chest, her eyes vacant, as if she'd retreated from this world long ago. Henry stood silently. He didn't rush forward. He knew that some wounds were so deep that even a sudden movement could shatter what little was left inside. The trailer door opened. A woman stepped out, a half-smoked cigarette in her hand, her eyes tired and indifferent. She hurts herself. The cage is just for protection. The doctor said she has problems. We're just doing the best we can. Henry didn't respond. A man appeared behind her, the smell of alcohol strong even from a distance. He smirked. "Who do you think you are?" "Superman. That kid's broken, doesn't talk, doesn't eat, doesn't sleep. She's not a kid anymore. She's a burden." Henry turned to look at them. His eyes weren't loud, but there was something in them that suddenly silenced them both. He took off his coat, carefully folded it, and walked towards the cage. He didn't bang on the door, didn't call her name, just said softly, in a deep, steady voice, "She's not a wild animal. She's a child, and I'm not going to let this continue." The little girl still didn't react, but in her eyes there was a flicker, as if what he'd just said wasn't the first time she'd heard it, but the first time she wanted to believe it. Henry stood motionless by the wire cage, his eyes fixed on the little girl sitting inside. No one spoke for several seconds. Only the wind whistled through the gaps in the rotting wood behind the trailer. The cage, made of rusty wire mesh and broken pallets, was about 5 feet tall and had no roof. The ground inside was bare dirt, dotted with a few scraps of torn paper and a stained old pillow. Unclear whether it was dirty or had once been soaked in blood. The little girl inside might have been 4 years old. She was so thin that her clothes hung baggy on her, as if she was wearing someone else's. Her black hair was matted to her forehead and neck. She wasn't crying, wasn't yelling, and wasn't looking at Henry. She was just sitting there, her knees pulled tight to her chest, her chin resting on her knees, her eyes wide open but empty, as if she had withdrawn from the world long ago. The trailer door creaked open. A woman stepped out, holding a cigarette, her flip-flops slapping on the rotting wooden steps. Her scraggly blonde hair was tied haphazardly behind her head. A faded Miller tattoo was visible on her wrist. Daisy Miller, somewhere in her 30s, was the little girl's aunt. Her voice was hoarse and blunt. "She has problems. Hurts herself. We don't want to lock her up, but what else are we supposed to do? People say she needs help. We're not experts." Daisy didn't apologize, didn't hide anything. She spoke as if she were recounting a story about the neighbor's dog barking too loudly. Henry turned to look not harshly, but directly. "And helping a child means locking her in a cage." Daisy blew smoke, avoiding his gaze. "This is for her safety. She used to bang her head against the wall, bite herself." A second figure appeared in the trailer doorway. Frank Miller, Daisy's husband, around 40. His shirt was open at the top, revealing a paunch, and he was holding a cheap can of beer. His eyes were bloodshot, and his voice slurred with alcohol. "Who do you think you are?" "Some kind of savior." Frank stepped down the 3 steps, a little unsteady but still managing a sarcastic tone. "That kid is broken. Won't eat unless you force her. Doesn't talk, doesn't even react when she sees you. She's a dead weight." Henry didn't respond immediately. He turned back to look at the little girl again. She still wasn't moving, as if no conversation was taking place. Then he took off his long coat, folded it in half, and walked closer to the cage. Daisy took a step back. Frank frowned slightly. Henry placed the coat on the metal railing, carefully, as if he were laying a layer of respect on something that had been violated for too long. His voice wasn't loud, but it was decisive, impossible to argue with. "She's not trash. Not a wild animal. She's a child." Frank burst out laughing, a dry, harsh laugh that echoed in the cold air. "You gonna take her away? No papers, no rights. She's my niece." Henry turned to look directly into Frank's eyes, for the first time allowing anger to surface. Not anger at being insulted, but anger that the world allowed this to happen. "I don't need rights to know what's right and what's wrong," he said slowly, "and I'm not here to ask permission." Frank took a step forward, but Daisy pulled her husband's arm. She didn't say anything, just shook her head slightly. In her eyes, something like fear emerged for the first time. Henry turned to the car parked a few houses away. He signaled to the driver, then took out his phone and dialed a number. When the other end picked up, he said concisely, "I need 3 lawyers, a psychological support team, and a camera. Now." He hung up and walked back to the cage. No one stopped him this time. The little girl still hadn't moved, hadn't blinked. Henry knelt down, sitting low at her eye level. He didn't touch the bars, didn't call her name, just looked at her silently. After a moment, the little girl tilted her head slightly, looking at him. The first reaction. That look didn't contain hope, nor fear. Just a silent question. "You'll leave too, like the others, won't you?" Henry understood. He took a deep breath, holding her gaze steadily. "I don't know who abandoned you, but I'm not one of them." He didn't know if she believed him or not, but he knew that to make a traumatized child trust again, it would take more than words. The police arrived 20 minutes after Henry's call, an old paint-peeling patrol car driving slowly as if there was no hurry. The lights weren't flashing. Inside were 2 local officers, middle-aged, looking more bored than alert. Officer Wade, the driver, was about 50, with a paunch and dark circles under his eyes from lack of sleep or too much cheap coffee. Next to him was Officer Hayes, younger, about 35, with a face as cold as ice. He nodded reflexively as he got out of the car, but his eyes darted quickly from Henry to the cage behind the trailer, and stopped there. Wade spoke first, his voice not overly concerned, but polite enough. "Mr. Shaw, we received a call about a special situation." Henry stood at the edge of the cage, not turning around. "There's nothing special about it. This is a child being illegally confined in the yard of 2 adults who are unfit to care for her. It's that simple." Wade glanced at Frank and Daisy, who were standing on the steps, their faces like stone, but their hands clenched tightly around empty beer cans. "The problem is," he hesitated, "their family. Niece, if I understand correctly. There's no complaint from healthcare or social services, and no clear evidence of physical abuse. So, what's that cage?" Henry asked bluntly, his voice still calm. "A new therapy tool?" Hayes avoided Henry's gaze. Wade scratched his head, continuing to evade. "Families have the right to care for young children, as long as there's no direct evidence of harm. If they say it's to protect her, it's legally difficult to intervene." Henry took his hand out of his pocket. He signaled for the driver to open the back of the car. One of the 3 people stepped out. George Lynn, chief lawyer of the Lightwell Foundation. Grey suit, black-rimmed glasses, his expression unchanged even when he saw the cage. Following him were 2 others, one of whom was holding a camera that had been on since they arrived. Henry turned back, looking directly at the 2 officers. "This camera has been recording the entire scene since we arrived, including the statements of those 2. He glanced towards Frank and Daisy. "I also have 3 lawyers here. If you don't intervene, this footage will be sent to the State Attorney General's office, along with a lawsuit for complicity and turning a blind eye to the illegal confinement of a minor." No one said anything. Hayes was the first to move. He walked to the cage, crouched down low, and looked closely at the little girl inside for the first time. His eyes slowly changed, from wary to confused, then heavy with sadness. He turned to Officer Wade. "If we don't do anything, we're part of this." Wade let out a long sigh, nodding. "Call Child Protective Services and call medical. We'll follow protocol." Frank shouted, "You have no right! She's my niece! We're raising her! No one knows what's going on better than us." Daisy was silent. Her eyes left Frank, looking down at the yard as if wondering how things had gone so far. A click rang out as the cage door was opened. Hayes was the one who undid the latch, his movements slow and gentle. Henry didn't interfere. He just stood there, waiting. The little girl, whose name no one knew yet, didn't move at all. Not afraid, not hopeful. Just looked up at Henry as if she had seen people come, promise, and then turn their backs and leave. She didn't expect anything, just watched. Henry crouched down. Carefully, he held out his hands, not touching her, but just leaving them there. An invitation, not a demand. "You don't have to trust me. You don't have to say anything at all, but you don't deserve to be locked up like this." The little girl didn't answer, but after a few seconds, as long as silence in a church, she leaned towards him, very slightly, not rushed, not out of complete trust, but because she had nothing left to lose. Henry wrapped his arms around her thin body. She was as light as nothing, didn't resist, nor cling. He stood up, carrying her out of the cage, out of the place that had stolen her childhood, her voice, and a child's trust. No one stopped him. Frank retreated into the house. Daisy turned away. Hayes stood aside, bowing his head. Henry walked straight to the car, the little girl in his arms. She didn't look around, didn't ask where she was going. She just looked at him, as if wondering, will this time be any different? When he got in the car, Henry placed her on the seat next to him, fastening her seatbelt with a gentle and patient movement. Then he took his coat, the one he'd placed on the cage earlier, and wrapped it around her. In that moment, he wasn't a founder, wasn't a wealthy man from somewhere else. He was just a human being, sitting next to a child who had been forgotten for too long. He leaned down, speaking very softly, not for the cameras, not for the police, but just for the little girl. "I don't know who abandoned you first, but that person won't be me." The car rolled away, leaving Maple Street behind. The psychological stabilization facility was located in the southern suburbs, almost 3 hours' drive from Burnsville. There were no large gates, no fancy signs, just a small white-painted building, nestled quietly among the gray trees of winter. The scent of pine, old filing paper, and mild disinfectant hung in the air. A place designed not to impress, but to quietly hold people when they couldn't hold themselves. Henry didn't go into the main lobby when the car stopped. He stayed with the little girl, adjusting the coat around her, then gently lifted her out. Doctors, nurses, social workers were already there, all informed and prepared. But no one rushed. They didn't approach, didn't offer papers, didn't ask questions. Everyone understood that, at this stage, silence was the first step to rebuilding something broken. The little girl was taken to a private room, walls painted in neutral colors, soft lighting, no sharp objects or unusual noises. Everything was soft, minimal, like a space where memories couldn't cling to explode. Henry didn't go in. He stayed at the doorway, nodded to the doctor in charge, and turned to the hallway. From that day on, Henry came every day, same time. Every late afternoon, at exactly 5 o'clock, he was in the hallway outside the little girl's room. He didn't ask the nurses for results, didn't call for updates, didn't interfere with the therapy schedule. He just sat down on the wooden chair outside, opened his brown leather briefcase, took out some files, and didn't read them. No one asked why he did it, because no one needed to ask. Henry's presence was part of the method. Traumatized children didn't need someone to rescue them. They needed someone who wouldn't leave. The little girl's name was discovered on the third day. Aileen. She still didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't resist being bathed, dressed, or examined. But there were no other reactions. Aileen's eyes were like a still lake, not because it was peaceful, but because beneath the surface was a cold abyss that nothing could touch. The therapists tried many approaches, from play therapy, image therapy, contact through movement, but she didn't respond. Some of the younger staff began to doubt. Could she be beyond help? Only Dr. Elena Rowe, the direct supervisor, maintained the necessary persistence. She had worked with abused children for over 20 years. She knew that a slow response wasn't hopeless. It was proof that trauma had eaten into the structure of trust. She's not avoiding contact, she told Henry one afternoon as he was leaving. But she doesn't believe in anything left in this world, doesn't believe in words, doesn't believe in gentleness, and doesn't believe in the existence of unconditional love. Henry listened, nodding, not arguing, not denying. He just said, "I'll still be there, every day." The first week passed without change. Aileen remained motionless. The doctor reported, "The psychology is still completely closed off." She slept very little, or rather, didn't believe in sleep. As if just closing her eyes would mean being abandoned again. She was sensitive to absolute silence. When the room was silent, she began to breathe quickly, her hands cramped, her eyes darting around. But if the TV was turned on, music was played, or an artificial voice was broadcast, she would curl up, as if every sound was an echo from a distant world. There was only one thing she accepted: Henry's footsteps at 5 o'clock. No one said it, but everyone noticed. When that hour came, her heart rate slowed. She didn't approach the door, but she didn't avoid it either. One day, a nurse reported that Aileen had glanced at the door 3 times when she heard it open, the first voluntary movement from her. Henry still didn't go in. He still sat in the hallway, the briefcase on his lap, his hands not opening the files. The soft yellow light covered his shoulders every afternoon. The white wall in front of him remained the same. But Aileen knew someone was still sitting there, not coming to chat, not coming to force her to be happy, just sitting there. The second week, Henry was allowed to stay longer. On the 10th day, as he prepared to leave, a very soft sound came from the doorway, the creak of a hinge. He turned, not moving. The door opened slightly. Aileen was standing inside, looking at him. Her eyes still had no expression, but this time there was something different. Not fear, not doubt, but recognition. As if she had finally connected a fragile thread from the image outside the door to a memory that was no longer broken. No one said anything. Aileen just stood there for a few seconds, then quietly closed the door. No sound, no signal. But for Henry, it was enough. The next day was no different. The sky was still grey, the hallway still empty. The smell of disinfectant still lingered in the air. The wooden chair Henry sat on was still in the right place, next to the simple white door frame with the name Aileen, Room 2 on it. A light plaid shirt, a dark wool coat, a leather briefcase neatly placed on his lap. His hands still didn't open the files, still didn't hold the phone. He just sat there, silently, his feet touching the floor, his hands clasped together, his eyes looking at the wall opposite, where there was nothing worth looking at, but he still looked. A familiar gesture, a rhythm that no one told anyone about, No one pushed, but Elin had gotten used to. He sat for almost an hour each day. Not too long to be intrusive, not too short for her to ignore his presence. But today, when he arrived, something had changed. His wooden chair, still in its usual place, had a piece of paper lying neatly on the seat. Not folded, not glued, just placed there as a silent expectation. Henry stood still for a few seconds. He looked down, not rushing to touch it. The paper was drawn on with wax crayons. The lines were shaky, clumsy, out of proportion, with no elaborate details. But the image was clear. A man, a little girl, two people sitting next to each other, not holding hands, not hugging, just sitting side by side. In the middle of them, a red heart, very small, drawn over and over until the paper was almost torn. No name, no words, no other symbols. Henry crouched down, picked up the paper with both hands, as if it might break if he only used one. He looked at it for a long time. No one in the hallway, no medical staff, no nurses, just him, the chair, and the paper. He didn't smile, nor did he cry, just quietly folded the paper in half, carefully like folding a letter from wartime, then placed it in his inside coat pocket. Then he sat down, not changing his posture, not turning his head to the door. But for the first time, he spoke aloud, not loudly, not for anyone to hear, just for the drawing and for the person who had left it there. "I see you, Elin." She didn't peek out that day, didn't stick her eye through the crack, nor give any other signals. But Henry knew that, from behind the soundproofed wood and the soft yellow light, Elin was listening. Maybe she didn't understand everything. Maybe she didn't believe everything. But she had seen him, and he had seen her. And in the world of children who had been invisible for too long, just a look being returned was already the beginning of something real. The next day, Henry still arrived on time. The chair was still in its usual place. There was no new drawing. But this time, when he sat down, the room door opened slightly. Elin wasn't standing there, but from the crack in the door, a small doll, the kind of toy the nurses had left in the room a few weeks earlier, was pushed out. Its back was to the door. Its face was towards him. A detail that seemed simple. Henry understood. She was watching, but wasn't ready to appear. She sent an object in her place. Something easy to hide, easy to take back if she was wrong. But it carried a clear message. "I see you." Henry didn't pick up the doll. He didn't reach out, didn't do anything to break that fragile signal. He just leaned slightly, bowed his head towards the toy, and said a single sentence, "I'm still here." That evening, in the center's conference room, Dr. Elena Rowe wrote a new line in Elin's file. Change in connection status. Proactive non-verbal communication. Communication takes place outside the scope of therapy, with the only person who is regularly present, Henry Shaw. A young staff member asked, should he be having so much contact? Could she become dependent? Elena shook her head. No need for a long explanation. Just said, children who have been imprisoned often lose the ability to distinguish between care and control. But Elin chose him, not because he rescued her, but because he doesn't force her. 3 days later, another piece of paper appeared. This time it wasn't placed on the chair. It was glued inside the door, where only Henry could see it when the door was ajar at just the same angle as the day before. The paper drew an empty chair. On the chair was a briefcase. Next to the chair was a wall, with a drawing of 2 eyes on it. No heart this time, no people, but it was all clear. Elin had seen him sitting there, and recorded it. No words needed. Henry didn't respond with a drawing, nor did he leave anything behind. He just continued to come, on time. And when it was time to leave, he gently touched the doorknob, then let go, not opening it, not going inside. Just leaving his hand there for a moment, long enough for Eileen on the other side to feel that something was still present. The presence didn't force her to open up. It simply allowed her to choose. By the end of the week, Eileen stepped out of the room for the first time when Henry had already left. No one told anyone. The little girl just opened the door, stepped into the empty hallway, and walked slowly to the empty chair. Sat down. Not long. Just a few minutes. Then went back to the room. For the first time in almost a month, the camera system recorded a new image. A skinny little girl, hair tangled, eyes empty, sitting exactly where a man still sat every day. Sitting up straight, her hands on her lap, exactly the same as he had kept them for dozens of afternoons. The night was no different. The wind blew softly through the windows of the treatment room. The clock on the wall ticked. The night light still shone warm yellow as always. But Eileen couldn't sleep. She lay curled up under a thin blanket, her eyes wide open, looking at the ceiling. There was nothing there, but in her head, something remained. It was the sound of iron rubbing together. It was the musty smell in the old cage. It was Frank's face when he was drunk. It was the cold that didn't come from the weather, but from indifference. Eileen closed her eyes, but in the sleep she had just touched, a scream rang out, short, intermittent. She sat up, sweat soaked her back. Her eyes were panicked. The night shift nurse entered, intending to turn on the light. But Eileen shook her head. She didn't want light, nor did she want to speak. Just a soft sentence, like half a breath. Don't lock me up. Henry was called close to midnight. He wasn't wearing fancy clothes, just a simple sweater, his face a little pale from lack of sleep. But his eyes were very awake. Eileen sat in the corner of the bed, hugging a pillow with both hands. She didn't say anything when he came in, nor did she look up. But she didn't hide, didn't avoid him, just silent, as if asking, "You're still here, aren't you?" Henry sat down on the chair next to the bed. Not close, not asking questions. After a moment he spoke, not to soothe the fear, but to share the silence that was making Eileen suffocate. "When I was your age, I also had nightmares." Eileen turned her head slightly, not looking directly, but her eyes had left the pillow. "At that time, my house had no windows. The room only had a yellow light bulb. Every night I lay there. I imagined something was waiting outside the door, not calling, not coming in, just standing there looking." His voice was even, slow, not trying to tell a fairy tale, not trying to lighten the fear. "I used to cry, but no one listened. So I did one thing. Every night, I told myself a story." Eileen frowned, not understanding. Henry smiled, very slightly. "I pretended there was someone sitting at the end of the bed, a grown-up. I imagined that person would listen to everything I said, even the smallest thing. I didn't know who that person was, but just knowing someone was there made me feel safe enough to sleep." Eileen didn't answer, but her eyes had stopped darting. Her hands had loosened the pillow a little. Henry stood up, walking to the door. But instead of leaving, he sat down next to the room door, his back against the wall, his hands on his knees. He called out, not loudly, but enough for Eileen to hear clearly. "I don't know what you dreamed of, but if anything from the dream wants to chase you, it has to go through me first. And I'm sitting here until you sleep." An hour later, Eileen fell asleep again. This time, her shoulders weren't tense, her hands weren't clenched. She lay on her side, still hugging the pillow, but her face softened. Not because the nightmare had disappeared, but because she knew that outside there was a real person awake. Henry was still sitting there. He wasn't asleep, but not tired. He used to be the boy no one sat with. Now, he was the adult who knew that. The darkness wasn't as scary as waking up and not seeing anyone there. The next morning, Aileen woke up. Henry was no longer sitting by the door, but on the small chair next to the bed, there was a piece of paper folded in half, clipped with a short pencil. Aileen opened it, the familiar handwriting. "Next time, tell me the story again, about a better dream. Okay?" Below the line was a scribbled drawing, a grown-up and a child, sitting at either end of the bed. In between was a black shadow, blocked, unable to advance. Aileen looked at it for a moment, then smiled. The third morning of the new week began as usual: cold air, quiet hallway, medical staff speaking in low voices. The treatment center was never noisy, never rushed. Time here didn't pass by the clock, but by small, slow, and almost invisible changes. Henry arrived at 5 o'clock, as usual. Today, he was wearing a long grey coat with a thin wool scarf wrapped around his neck. When he sat down in his usual chair, he faintly realized that something was different. Not from the hallway, but from inside. Aileen's room door was still closed. There was no piece of paper, no doll, no signs of welcome or rejection. But he could feel that someone was standing right on the other side of that door, not just looking at him, but listening to him in silence. He didn't speak. He just opened his briefcase, took out his work calendar, folded it up, and put it aside as usual. But instead of opening the files, he pulled out the first drawing from his inside pocket. The drawing of two people and the red heart. He opened it with both hands, placed it on his lap, looking at it. No unnecessary movements, no reminiscing, no teaching. Just a man, quietly holding on to something important that others thought had been forgotten. Inside the room, Aileen leaned against the wall, her eyes fixed on the door. She had been outside the chair 2 more times this week, each time for less than 10 minutes. No one pushed, no one encouraged. But each time, she returned to the room before anyone appeared. She knew. Henry couldn't see through the wall, but he always recognized her presence, even when she wasn't there. And today, something in her heart was beginning to want to be heard. The afternoon therapy session took place as usual. Dr. Elena sat at one end of the room, holding a box of wax crayons. Aileen sat on the other side, with a blank sheet of paper in front of her. They didn't say much. "You can draw or not," Elena said, as usual. "You can look out the window, or just sit. It's all okay." Ellen didn't move. Her hands were on her knees, not touching the crayons. Suddenly, the little girl tilted her head slightly. The movement was as light as a feather being pushed by the wind. Her eyes left the blank sheet of paper and moved towards the room door. Not towards Dr. Elena. A very slight moment. Elena noticed. She didn't ask. Just gently opened her notebook. A minute passed. Then Aileen whispered, so softly that it seemed like only a breath slipped across her throat. "Henry." Nothing more, not calling, not looking at anyone, not confirming that she had just spoken. Just one word, one sound, one broken rhythm, but not out of tune. Elena didn't react immediately, didn't take notes hastily. She just nodded slightly, not because she was happy, but because she knew what had just happened was real. One word, and it wasn't father, it wasn't aunt, it wasn't someone, but it was a person's name, the name she had chosen to attach to the first safety she knew. The professional meeting took place at 6 o'clock. Aileen spoke, Elena reported briefly. One word. "Should we inform Henry?" a staff member asked. Elena shook her head. No need. He'll know, if she wants him to know. The next day, Henry came as usual. No one said anything to him. No message from the center. No special announcement. He didn't ask either. But when he walked to the chair, he paused for a moment. Longer than usual. There was no piece of paper, no doll, just a small handprint, faintly imprinted on the edge of the wooden chair, as if a child had placed her hand on it. Not wiping it off, not covering it up. He sat down, his hands still resting on the briefcase, but this time he leaned slightly to the left, moving the chair closer to the door. Just a little bit. Not to enter, not to hear more clearly, but to respond to something that had been sent. Inside, Elin stood close to the edge of the bed, her eyes towards the door. She didn't open it, didn't peek out, just stood. But in her heart, something for the first time was no longer silent, no longer locked up. She didn't know why she had blurted out that name. She only knew that, at that moment, she needed to call something real, not leaving, and had a place to return to. Elin didn't know if that word was enough to change everything, but she knew it wasn't returned. Henry didn't come to celebrate, didn't hug her tightly, didn't knock on the door to ask. He just came, as usual, and sat closer. A week later, Elin drew another picture, not placed outside the chair, not glued behind the door. She gave it to the on-duty nurse. "Give it to Henry." The paper was folded in half, placed in a blank envelope. When Henry received it, he opened it. 2 simple drawings as before. One was him, sitting in his familiar chair. One was the little girl. This time, sitting next to him, no longer with a heart in between. There was only one line written in non-childlike handwriting. "I'm not scared of you." Henry folded the paper back up slowly, put it in his inside coat pocket, along with the first piece. He didn't say anything, but that afternoon, when he sat down in the chair, he didn't place the briefcase on his lap as usual anymore. He put it on the floor and opened his hands, placing them on the chair, so that if a small hand wanted to come closer, it would know it had a place to be there. One morning in the middle of the week, the treatment center was as usual, quiet, rhythmic, and slow as the breathing of people who were used to living with trauma. Elin walked into the therapy room with Dr. Elina without anyone having to remind her. She didn't smile, didn't speak, but her steps were steadier. There were no more scenes of her standing hesitantly at the door for minutes or avoiding eye contact with the nurses. Henry wasn't present during that therapy session. He still maintained his limits, not interfering in the professional recovery process, not changing his role from a support to an enforcer. But strangely, Elin mentioned him. The little girl sat down in the chair, placed her hands on the table, then looked up at Dr. Elina. "Can I ask Henry something? Is that okay?" Elina just nodded, not hiding her surprise, but her eyes softened very quickly. "What do you want to ask?" Elin pursed her lips for a few seconds. She turned her head towards the door, where no one was standing, then looked back at Elina. "I want to choose clothes to wear." That was the first time Elin had made a specific request, not asking for something, nor testing limits, but an act of self-affirmation, a way of saying, "I can decide for myself." That evening, Elina relayed the message to Henry in the short meeting at the end of the day. She recounted it verbatim, without adding or subtracting. Henry listened, then nodded gently. He didn't smile, but something in his eyes softened, as if what he was waiting for wasn't words, but awareness. The awareness that Elin wanted to live as someone who had the right to decide. The next day, when Henry arrived, he brought a large cloth bag, simple, with no brand. He placed it outside Elin's room door. No knocking, no calling, just left it there, then sat down in the chair as usual. 15 minutes later, the door cracked open. Elin poked her head out. Her eyes met his. And for the first time, she didn't retreat. She opened the door wide, stepped out, and bent down to pick up the bag. Inside were 8 different shirts, various colors, various designs, a green hoodie with a large dinosaur printed on the chest, a yellow t-shirt with a smiling sun, a thick sweater, mouse grey, with nothing but warmth. None of them were expensive, no fashion labels. All were soft, loose, comfortable. Henry didn't say anything when Elin took the bag back inside. She didn't need permission. She had been given power. When Henry turned back, Elin was wearing the green hoodie. The shirt was a little long, the sleeves covering her wrists, but she didn't adjust it. She wore it as if the shirt was a small cocoon where she could curl up and choose how to step out at her own pace. Henry just looked, then nodded slightly. No praise, no admiration. Just a look confirming that. You chose. And that's right. That afternoon, after the short therapy session, Elin returned to the chair next to him for the first time. No one invited her. She came, sat next to him, her hands on her knees, not looking at him. 5 minutes passed in silence. Then she spoke, very softly. If I scream, will I be locked up again? The question wasn't a test, but a scar speaking. Henry turned. He didn't react immediately, just looked at her silently for a long time. Then, from his inside pocket, he took out a small key attached to a soft leather keychain. He placed it in her hand, slowly, without coercion. This is the key to my office. You can lock it, or open it, any time. No one will force you. No one will lock you up. He paused for a moment, then continued, You don't belong in any cage. Not ever again. Elin held the key in her hand for a long time. She didn't ask anything else, nor did she answer. But when she clenched her hand for the first time, Henry realized that hand was no longer shaking. That evening, Elina wrote in her report, Day 41, Elin identifies herself through choice, knows how to distinguish between reaction and autonomy, asks questions that control the situation, no longer purely defensive. No one in the center read that report without stopping. Henry didn't read the report. He just kept the image of Elin in the green hoodie, holding the key, and her eyes no longer avoiding his gaze. Not because she was no longer afraid, but because now she knew she had the right to choose, both in fear and when overcoming it. Henry had never told Elin about the fear he carried every time he walked out of the center. He still sat on that hallway bench every afternoon, still leaving his palm open on the chair as before. But as Elin began to ask, as she began to call his name, as the leather-covered key was held tight in her hand, he began to fear. Not afraid that she was weak, but afraid that the outside world would find a way to call her back, in the name of blood ties, in the name of guardianship, or simply because the law hadn't fully understood what was pain and what was okay. He knew Frank and Daisy had been investigated, but he also knew that in this legal system, delay was another form of violence, so he didn't wait. 3 days after the afternoon he gave Elin the key, Henry called George Lynn, his closest lawyer. I want to gain full custody of Elin, Henry said without hesitation, permanently, unconditionally, no shared agreement. George nodded, not asking why. But he needed evidence, and Henry knew that. So he began to investigate. Together with a personal assistant, Claire, a sharp, reserved woman who had worked in the field of protecting minors, they returned to Burnsville, not to cause trouble, but to collect all the things that had never been asked. They went to the medical station that had recorded Elin as falling, but had not reported. Claire asked for copies of old records, one fractured wrist, one long cut on her right cheek, all bandaged, no investigation of the cause. They went to the grocery store where Daisy used to buy wire and old pallets, and an employee remembered very well. She said she was making a dog pen, but in the back of the car, there were children's things. They found a neighbor who had seen Elin through the hedge, without a shirt, sitting in the cage in the hot sun. That person had taken a picture, but had never submitted it. Now, they agreed to hand it over. Claire gave all the data to George: photos, statements, invoices, medical records. Henry only said one sentence: "I won't let her have to look back again." When the file was submitted to court, Henry still didn't say anything to Elin. He continued to sit in the hallway chair, continuing to let her decide everything at her own pace. But inside him, everything was arranged, from the faded photos, the dusty documents, to every line describing Elin as livestock in the neighbor's statement. He didn't use those things to retaliate. He used them to cut the chains. One morning, Elena came to Henry's office in the center, handing him a court order that had been approved. On it, printed in bold, "Full irrevocable custody. Legal guardian, Henry Shaw." Elena didn't say much. She just placed her hand lightly on the file. "The little girl won't know this today, but one day, when Elin looks back at her past records, she'll see that someone didn't leave." That evening, when Elin was sitting next to him in the yard, she told him about a dream. "I dreamed I was running. Behind me was the cage. But you were at the end of the road, not calling, just standing there." Henry looked at her. "And you ran to me?" Elin nodded. "Then you locked the door. The cage couldn't follow anymore." Henry squeezed her shoulder gently, not to hold her, just to confirm. "It will never follow you again." The courtroom wasn't large, nor cold, just simple and bare. Like a place created to put the truth in the middle of rough wooden chairs and glaring fluorescent lights. No one cried. No one shouted, just the sound of papers turning, the sound of shoes tapping on the wooden floor, and the sound of the clock, counting time, passing by with pure indifference. Elin wasn't there. She didn't need to witness the faces that had called her a burden. She didn't need to see the room where adults argued about her value as if it were a number. Henry had decided from the beginning. The trial wasn't for Elin. It was for the silence that everyone pretended not to see. Frank Miller sat at the defendant's table, a wrinkled white shirt, a crooked tie, darting eyes. Daisy sat next to him, disheveled blonde hair, holding a plastic water bottle, shaking it constantly, but not drinking. They didn't look at each other, nor did they look at the gallery. On the other side, the lawyers representing the Lightwell Foundation presented the medical report, a 47-page document accompanied by CT scan images, blood tests, psychological analysis results. The final diagnosis: post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic malnutrition, signs of skin damage from prolonged contact with dirty materials. The voice of lawyer George Lynn was even, not dramatic, not adding emotion. He didn't need to. The data was enough to speak for itself. Frank spoke for the first time when asked, "Were you aware of Elin's condition while she was with you?" He shrugged. "She was wild. Not like normal kids. We didn't know what to do. No one taught us how to handle kids like that." Daisy chimed in, her voice quieter. "We didn't beat her. We just wanted to keep her safe. She used to bang her head against the wall, bite her hands. We were afraid she'd hurt herself." "You mean confine her in a cage?" "It wasn't a cage, just a safe area." No one in the room reacted. No one sneered or scolded. Their impassivity was the clearest evidence. Henry sat in the second row, behind the lawyers. He didn't push forward, didn't need to step out as the main witness. But then, when he was invited to speak, he stood up, not carrying papers, not holding files. He walked to the reporting podium with the composure of a person not speaking for someone, but speaking correctly what he needed to say. He looked directly at the jury, then said, "No one can call Elin a wild child, because what she needs is a chair to sit on, a shirt to choose, and someone who doesn't leave." He paused for a beat, not looking at Frank or Daisy, but looking at the empty space in front of him. Everyone knew. Neighbors, clinic nurses, kindergarten teachers in the past, everyone knew something was wrong, and no one came. She was locked in a cage in broad daylight, in a town that wasn't too big to hide that, but was too silent to dare to say, "I'm not here to take revenge. I don't want to see anyone suffer more than necessary. I'm only standing here because Elin deserves to be believed, to be heard, to be recognized as a real person, not an item with errors to be hidden away, not a psychological problem, but a child who has been silent for too long." His voice was not loud, not tearful, just clear and enough. The judge read the verdict after 2 hours of deliberation, not long, not ambiguous. Frank and Daisy were convicted of unlawful imprisonment of a minor, neglect of basic care, failure to cooperate with child protective agencies, and providing false medical information. No leniency agreements, no suspended sentences. Frank slumped in his chair. Daisy collapsed as if about to faint. But no one came to support them. No one stood up for them. There were no movie scenes here, no applause, no cameras, just a silence that for the first time bore the name justice. On the way home, Henry didn't say anything. He looked out the car window, holding the medical file that he had kept in his briefcase all afternoon. In the file was an X-ray image of Elin's brain, blurry, but the light crack that had healed was visible, a silent detail, like everything Elin had endured. He didn't hold it to be angry, but to not forget. The truth doesn't need to be violent to have weight. That evening, when Henry returned to the center, Elin was sitting in the small yard behind. It wasn't cold, but she was still wearing the green hoodie with the dinosaur. Her hands were playing with fallen petals on the stone ledge. When he approached, she didn't look up, just asked softly, "Did they get yelled at?" Henry sat down next to her, not close, not far. "No one yelled." Elin thought for a moment, then nodded slightly. "I don't want them to hurt. It's just not to be near anymore. And now they're not near you anymore." The little girl didn't say anything more, but when she stood up to go inside, she stopped at the door, turning back to look at Henry. A long look, very long, not asking anything, just to make sure he was still there. Months passed after the trial. Elin had gradually broken free from the shadow of the past, suddenly one morning. The news was given one Monday morning. A family agreed to adopt Elin. Not out of pity, not because of a call from the media, but because they truly wanted her in their lives. The Foster family, true to their name, were a couple in their 40s, without children, living in a quiet town about an hour's drive from the center. Henry met them first in a consultation with Elina. He listened carefully to each answer, to each way they described not wanting to replace anyone, but only wanting to create a home with enough room for a child who doesn't have to struggle to survive. They said all the right things. The tone was gentle. Not a single empty promise. Not a single sentence trying to make Elin feel like she was lucky. They prepared a private room for her, curtains with pictures of the planets. The bed was designed low, so she could climb up herself without anyone helping. The closet was full of choices. Blue, orange, fox designs, cosmic designs. Everything was Perfect. On paper. Aileen was notified 3 days in advance. No reaction, no refusal. She just nodded and quietly went back to her room. Alina advised leaving her to think. No one hurried. No one forced her. That evening, Aileen folded each of her items and put them in the cloth bag. Not many. A few of her favorite clothes, the dinosaur hoodie, the first picture she sent to Henry, and the leather-covered key he gave her. Henry walked in as she was packing the doll she first put outside the door last month. He didn't say anything, just sat down next to her, watching her do it, not rushing, not hesitating, but unemotional. "That family is very good," Henry said gently. "They'll let you choose your clothes, choose colors, and they'll listen when you want to talk." Aileen didn't answer, but her hand paused on the bag strap. She squeezed it a little, then released it. After a long time, when everything was packed, she turned to look at him. This time, her eyes didn't avoid him. "If I leave, will you still be sitting in that hallway?" Henry nodded slowly. "There will still be someone sitting next to the door, even if I'm not there anymore." Aileen looked down at her hand. Her fingers touched the key in her pocket. She took it out, placed it on her open palm, then looked at him again. "If I call, will you come?" Henry didn't answer immediately. He sat up straight, bowing his head slightly, as if considering not the answer, but the weight of the promise. Then he said, in a voice that didn't rise or fall, just as clear as daylight, "Whenever you call, I will come." The next morning, the foster family's car came to pick her up. The couple stepped down with kind eyes. They didn't hug her. They just opened the car door, then bowed to her like an adult. Aileen stepped out of the center, a small bag on her shoulder. Her eyes darted around the hallway, the corners she used to sit, to draw, to be silent. She didn't cry. When she got close to the car, she stopped, turned back. Henry was still standing at the door, not calling after her, not waving, just standing there. Aileen walked towards him. She stopped close to him, looked up, and asked, "If you don't sit anymore, I won't know the way back." Henry bent down, placed his hand on her shoulder, gently. "I won't leave my place. There will always be someone sitting there, even if you don't see me." Aileen looked directly into his eyes. A very long moment. Then she turned her head, walking towards the car. She put the bag in the back seat, but didn't get in. Silence for a few seconds. Then she turned back, walking quickly towards Henry, stopping, looking up. Then, "I'm not going." Henry wasn't surprised, nor did he ask again. He just knelt down, placed his hands on his knees, and let Aileen put her tiny hand on his palm, like he used to leave his hands open on the hallway chair. A very small exchange, but enough for people to know that a choice had been made, not by words, but by faith. The foster family understood. They weren't disappointed. They left without bringing looks of blame or pity. Alina, when notified, just smiled. Choice is the first right Aileen has ever received, and she used it correctly. That evening, Aileen sat outside in the yard, the dinosaur hoodie covering her pillow. The sky was calm. Henry sat next to her, not close, not far. Aileen opened her bag, took out the key. "Do you remember what you said when you gave me this?" Henry nodded. "I don't belong in any cage." Aileen looked at him, her eyes shining brightly in the darkness. "So you can't lock yourself in that hallway forever either." Henry was silent, then smiled, a light, rare smile. "So who will sit there now?" Aileen answered immediately, without thinking. "Me." 1 year passed. Time doesn't heal everything, but it leaves soft footprints on the sand. Each step of Aileen, however small, still imprints. No one locks her in a cage anymore. No one forces her to be well-behaved. and no one assigns her a role in an adult's story. 1 year is enough for her to stop flinching when she hears the door close. Enough for her to choose her own drawing colors. Enough for her to sit alone in a room with the lights on without feeling like she is being left behind. And enough for her, on an evening like this, to step onto the stage in front of hundreds of people. It was the annual gala organized by the Lightwell Foundation. The location was an old theater, wooden dome, deep red chairs, soft yellow lights, nothing glitzy but warm enough. The entire event wasn't about fundraising, but about proving that children who are left behind can also stand in the center of the stage without having to force themselves to be pitied. Aileen wasn't forced to perform. She herself suggested it. "I want to play the piano." When asked what she wanted to call the piece, she just smiled, a smile as light as the last leaf on a tree branch in winter, then wrote on the paper, "The person sitting by the door." The party was nearing its end when the auditorium lights dimmed. The MC introduced it briefly, without telling a long biography, just saying, "The last performance by someone who doesn't need an introduction, because she herself is the story." The whole room went silent. Aileen walked onto the stage. No silk dress, no fancy updo. Just a 9-year-old girl, skinny, shoulder-length black hair, wearing a simple cream-colored dress, covered with the green dinosaur hoodie that she had kept for the past year. Even though it was a little tight now. She sat down on the piano chair, adjusted her hands, not looking at the audience. Then began to play. The music was very simple, not showing off technique, just a few chords, a few repeated melodies. But in the middle of that simplicity was something that adults could no longer play: honesty. Each piano key was like a piece of memory. The sound of the door opening gently, the sound of a drawing scratching on the table, the sound of the key being placed in her hand, the sound of someone sitting silently in the hallway all winter. Not one person breathed heavily in the auditorium. At the last note, Aileen released her hand from the piano keys. She didn't bow, nor did she linger. She just stood up, turned, and walked straight down. Cameras flashed continuously. The supporters, fund managers, reporters, donors, all turned to the little girl. But Aileen didn't go to them. She walked along the edge of the auditorium, past the front rows, past the camera lights, past all the admiration rising from all sides. She stopped when she reached the second row from the back, where there was an empty chair and a man was sitting, not taking his eyes off her all evening. Henry stood up, but didn't say anything. Aileen climbed into the chair next to him, the chair he had sat in for dozens of afternoons in the center hallway, quietly. No one forcing him to be there, but appearing every day. Now, she was sitting there. She didn't look at him right away, just leaned lightly on his shoulder, then spoke, very softly, enough for him to hear no one else. "Now it's your turn to sit still. I'll stay." He didn't answer, just placed his hand on the little girl's hand, not grasping, not holding, just presence. That chair was no longer empty, and the person who used to sit there used to be silent, used to wait, finally got to rest. Because that child had chosen her seat. Not a perfect place, not a family written by last names, but a place where there was someone who didn't walk away, even when she had never called. A home that didn't need a roof, just a chair next to someone who wouldn't leave. If you've listened to this story until the very last moment, I want to say something simple and most sincere. Thank you. Because stories like Aileen's, seemingly just fiction, just an emotional performance, are actually happening out there. Somewhere, there are still children imprisoned, not by iron bars, but by indifference, deemed broken, hard to teach, just because adults don't have enough patience to sit down next to them. But I'm not telling this story to make you sad. I'm telling it to remind you that sometimes the only thing a child needs is someone who doesn't leave. No heroes needed, no miracles, just an empty chair every day on time. Someone quietly sitting there, not asking, not rushing, not forcing, but never disappearing. Henry didn't save the world. He only did one thing: stay. And sometimes staying is the most steadfast protection. If you take anything away from this story, I hope it's this. We don't need to be perfect to be good people. We just need to be present. And don't walk away. Thank you for staying to the very end. See you in the next story, where hope still lives, even if only in a chair by the hallway.